Well, welcome and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are listening to our fireside chat today. Today, I have joining me Johnny from SOMA Cyber, and I am excited to have Johnny on today. And being discussed today, we are going to be talking about some cybersecurity assessments and some battle plans and some blind spots and all that goes with it. So I'm excited to take you on our conversation today. I've known Johnny for several years now, and he's agreed to come on and talk to us and share his subject matter expertise and background. So, Johnny, why don't you give a little bit of a background on yourself and introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. I won't go too deep, but I'm retired Air Force. While in the Air Force, I did a great deal of IT in there, and that's kind of where much of my foundation came from IT operations and information security. After retirement, worked a few DoD contracts and a few other things before I jumped fully to the security side of the fence. And then we formed SOMA Cyber back in 2023. And it's a small firm, but we focus a lot on information security, cybersecurity controls and consulting, pen testing, and those kind of things. So we enjoy what we do, and we love working with our clients on those issues.
That's awesome. I think smaller is better. I think a lot of organizations today prefer to work with smaller boutique organizations. Things get done, they get across the finish line, and you're not waiting long periods of time for people to get organized, right?
It's true. It's true.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for your service. Appreciate
you.
Your military background and the time that you put in there. I think that sometimes is not highlighted enough. So thank you.
I appreciate that.
Well, one of the areas that I sort of wanted to ask you today is I have several, but as we look at like cybersecurity, and I think sometimes assessments, they're either well noted or they're sort of kind of blown out of proportion. But as you think about cybersecurity assessments in your background and actually performing them and doing them, what is the critical step for businesses today as they're thinking about a cybersecurity assessment?
One, it's just do it. But be it a self-assessment or whether you hire a firm, I would say make sure you wrap your arms around that and that you're paying attention to your controls or the lack of is the biggest fear. But the main thing there is you're trying to assess your information security or cybersecurity maturity. And when you look, if we're talking from a small business perspective, you're looking about 60% of small businesses close within 6 months of a breach. That should be enough initiative right there to get that ball rolling. But if you're a regulatory compliant type organization, be it a bank or healthcare, you have to pay attention to those things. Your stakeholders want some type of confirmation that we are indeed paying attention to those information security controls. And that's probably one of the biggest critical steps is just admitting you need it and making sure management's behind that process.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, sometimes, you see people actually make a little bit of too big of a fuss, around an assessment. Should I get it? Should I not? When's the right time? What other ducks in a row should we accomplish, before we go get an assessment, and there's sort of like this over agonizing, about an assessment. I don't know if you ever see that or feel that way.
We do see that. What framework should we be using, especially if it's someone's initial assessment? There's a lot of pain, whether it be expense or the right timing, or even whether we're actually a target or not. Those are always topics. So.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about like some misconceptions about assessments, right? People oftentimes, well, what's the expense of them? Are they too expensive? Can we afford to go get one? And I don't know if you're prepared today to kind of maybe share some some price ranges that you see out in the marketplace, or something that would allow somebody, if they're watching or listening to this this fireside chat, that maybe gives them like, oh, we actually could afford, to go and get an assessment or something to that effect. But certainly not trying to put pricing, on the table, but just to try and give people like an understanding, like, hey, if they want a Tesla, they realize like, oh, I can actually go get a used Tesla for about 20 grand, right? So if they want a cybersecurity readiness assessment, what's some things that they should know about it, and that type of thing.
Well, that's a good question, and that's a good way to frame that. I think it doesn't have to be a full-on assessment initially. You brought up readiness assessment just then. We started doing readiness assessments several years ago because we would go into a client that wanted an assessment, and we would get there and realize they were in no way ready for that assessment. So we felt maybe a little bit bad. We have these expensive fees. We've gone through this process, and at the end of the day, it wasn't as beneficial as it should have been. So we stepped back and said, how do we help someone that just needs to get off the ground? And that's a readiness assessment.
Yeah.
It ranges. It's really hard to throw out pricing because it's based on the size of your organization and how much you expect from us. But probably the most inexpensive place to start is with that readiness assessment. If you feel like you're somewhat ready, then yeah, you will want to jump into the assessment. But as far as pricing, if you have a decent firm, they will work with you on the expense. They will work with you on those fees, because especially small firms like us and other people I know in small firms, they really love what they're doing and they love their relationships with their clients. They are going to find a way to assist you. If you feel too small at times to go through a full assessment or do not quite have that budget, they'll figure out a way. We actually just completed an assessment with an office that had 4 people in it. So there's always a way to get through that. But I think it's critical to understand that you're a target. Everybody's a target, especially in most small business owners don't think they are a target. And that makes you more of a target, actually. So don't overlook items like frequency. An IT control test is not a one and done, just like a financial audit. Those are annual. Your IT audits should be annual or sometimes more frequent based on your risk. So keep that in mind. But at the end of the day, you start with a readiness, you move on through full control testing. The goal is just maturity. We want to see your environment get as mature as possible in the information security world.
You start to talk about maturity, boy, and I get excited because that's really what everybody is trying to do, right? Is mature for where they're at today to where they think that they need to be, or where they know that they need to be as far as a cybersecurity perspective, that actual security. Like, they know that they're not great today. We need to get better. What's that roadmap and that journey look like? And that's really where you come in, right? One of the things that I wanted to sort of chat about as we're talking about this start, like, where do I start? And starting with that cybersecurity assessment, we've covered that. So what are some of the biggest hurdles organizations face when kicking off a cybersecurity assessment?
That's a tough question because it really depends on who's asking. If it's the vCISO or an IT manager asking, sadly, it's convincing management that you actually need to do it and fund it and get them to fund that. We see a big disconnect with management and IT. Just about every portion of the company, be it finances, pay raises, anything else, that's a management decision. But when you get into information security, that's an IT issue. So if it's a vCISO or an IT manager calling us wanting engagement, that the biggest hurdle is convincing management that you need it and to pay for it. But if it's management hiring us, which is the most common, and especially in the financial services realm, sometimes it can be convincing the IT staff, your faculty at a higher education, and that staff that you need to do this process. Getting their buy-in is a pretty big hurdle. Outside of that, I think another big hurdle is time. It is going to pull time away from your IT staff for a little while. We generally, when we start an engagement, we're sending you request lists like 4 to 6 weeks out. Well, it takes time to pull that data, and then you have time of the actual engagement. But being that we're all from operations, everybody in this company was initially IT operations people. We're very conscious of that and try not to, wear you down. But there's time, and then lastly is that framework. If you haven't agreed internally on a framework, you can't agree on controls. So
Isn't that something?
yeah, and we see it all the time. Yeah. But we don't care what framework you choose. If you have anything, we don't care what it is, you're moving in the right direction. So
Yeah. I think you and I have spoke a bunch on this topic, and NIST is always like one of those frameworks to get started with, right? Read, NIST 800, 171, read, NIST, just the framework itself is a good one to get started with, right?
Yeah.
And then, don't be afraid of it. Like, you probably realize that you're already doing some things there, and so it's not this daunting task, right? But then, do you need to look at PCI? Do you need to inform yourself maybe about how does the MITRE ATT&CK framework look and work, and where do I match up to that? What am I doing, right?
Yeah. For most of our small organizations, I think you nailed it. NIST cybersecurity framework is a great framework to us. We love it. It's well written. It writes almost executive level explanations of why you're testing these things. I think it's a good framework.
Yeah. Yeah, and we always, share that with folks when, they're starting with us. It's like, let's just start it with some basics, right? And that sort of leads into one of the questions that I had for you that I wanted to go over, which was like, when you think about how businesses can move beyond the guesswork and move from gut feeling to actual real life scenario, and get a clear picture of the vulnerabilities, what does that mean for them? As far as a business moving on beyond the guesswork and getting a clear picture of vulnerabilities.
If we're talking initial assessments, if we're talking with someone that we haven't worked with before or that hasn't gone through this, that could be kind of a long answer. So I'm going to be as quick and concise as possible. But
yeah,
the first thing we look for is an inventory. If you don't know you own it, you cannot protect it. So
I
that
love
being
that statement.
hardware, data, we need a data inventory and data classification. Where's your data parked? Once you have collected that information, you have pretty much what you need to start your information security risk assessment. And that's where you're documenting all of your internal and external threats to that data and to that hardware. That is your foundation. If you do not have that, there's going to be aspects of your control tests that are miserable. You may have great controls in place, but none of the security policies, there to hold those standards there. So that to me is, if you don't have those three components, the hardware, software, data inventory, and as well as the risk assessment, you're doing a lot of guesswork.
Yeah.
And then, you can then take that and use that information, even, start an IT control test, do a self-assessment, download that NIST cybersecurity framework, and at least you start getting a little bit of a mental picture of it. And do a vulnerability scan, start your IT control testing and pen testing, and then you start validating the things that were on that risk assessment. And that's really the only way you can remove the guesswork, though, is to start with what you own. If you, again, I hate saying it because it sounds cliche, but if you don't know you own it, you can't protect it. And I know that's where a lot of, especially in banking, the regulators start with an inventory.
I love that statement. And I think that if you're not, living, breathing that statement right now, you probably should. You should write it down. You should put it on a note on your monitor. You should put it on the wall. And that should be your beacon right there. We still run into a lot of organizations across, the U.S. and abroad that don't have that down. When we ask them, hey, what's your asset inventory look like, your data inventory, and your documentation around this, and they start opening up other tools and see, well, I've got this tool and it's got all of these agents installed. And so I kind of use this as my barometer or my bellwether of our asset inventory. We're like, well, wait a minute. What if assets don't have these agents installed? And it's, you can start kind of poking away right away at like some of the why you shouldn't do that. There are good tools out there in the space that specifically go after asset inventory, data inventory, and things of that nature. That's their core subject matter expertise, and you should be using those tools for that. Think about, for a moment, I want to double click on something you said, which was like when you think about an initial assessment, and how does that play into building a stronger security foundation?
Again, it's the maturity piece. You can't be one and done. I think the building into stronger is one, if you go through the security assessment, is making sure you're paying attention to the results of that assessment, of the vulnerability assessment, the pen test, or the IT control test. If you're given a list of gaps or findings, you have to close those findings. And that, to me, is one of the biggest problems we see is, you may repeat and come back to a client and they have the same exact findings open. And a lot of the times I see, and I hope I'm not jumping off the subject too much, is I'm not seeing those findings make it to management, the report make it to senior management, or management holding the IT staff accountable for getting those things closed and addressed. That's one of the big factors.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. We see it too, and I wonder if it sort of is still the gap that is happening between management and IT, in closing that gap. IT understanding management and management understanding IT, and the relationship that's happening there. Because completely agree with you, the gaps need to get closed. IT, I believe, is willing to do it. Most of the time they're willing to do it, but they either need time, money, resources, some way to execute. Sponsorship.
That executive sponsorship. You may know there's a gap that needs to be closed, but if you go click that button on your own as IT, the users are going to burn your house down, kind of thing. So that's a major factor.
Yeah. So, in something else that you said that makes me want to just chat about this for a moment, which is like, we think about an assessment and that's sort of the beginning, but it's also, it's not the end as well, right? An assessment is sort of a life cycle, right? Would you agree with that statement?
It absolutely is. Again, like we said, you have to address the results of that assessment, in a timely manner. And we've even gone into organizations and the controls were too strong on certain things. You're spending a lot of money and effort to close down a gap that really isn't that significant. So it goes both ways. But the ongoing piece is the most important. If you're not going through some type of recurring test, all you did was kind of check a box maybe for management and maybe your own personal satisfaction, and you're not really growing from there. But generally, especially for initial assessments, most of your IT auditors and firms, they're going to come in and they're going to focus on the elephants in the room. We've got to take care of these major things. And they don't want to give you 35 findings. They may say, okay, let's start with these 8. These are the ones that are scaring us to death for you. Let's start there. The next assessment, we're going to dig deeper and deeper and deeper. Because, you also have to understand there is a budget here, right? So there's only a block of hours you've purchased. So in that block of hours, let's focus as much as we can on the big things. And the future assessments, we're going to keep working on the maturity. And then, of course, controls change. The GOBA changed, NIST changed last year, CIS changed last year. So it changes testing as well.
Yeah, I love what you're talking about there. It's right. It's taking that assessment and moving through the life cycle, and it's really helping prioritize the facts that you found. And it is, nobody wants to feel like, if you've never been hiking or mountain climbing before, nobody is going out to Mount Everest for the first time. And I think sometimes in IT people sometimes don't want to talk about it or admit it, but it could be a daunting task. It could almost cause anxiety If somebody comes in, right, if you come in, Johnny, and you assess and you come up with 35, 40, 50, 60 things that need to get done, it looks like Mount Everest, right, to climb. But if you help boil that down to, let's just focus on these 8, like less than 10, let's go focus on these and get those done and put a plan together, so that the IT and management don't feel like this is not something that we can all like bite off and chew.
I 100% agree, and I would like to point out there that you know you have some IT folks, and I say it's rare. I think most of the IT managers and CISOs we work with, they welcome the feedback. They want to know their gaps. They want to provide a secure environment for their organization. But every now and then you have IT people that think this report is a reflection of their work. I
Yeah.
will tell you that most of our findings are management findings. Management hasn't implemented a policy. Management hasn't enforced a control. IT doesn't own the data. IT does not own the systems. They're there to enforce controls that are established by the owners of those systems, right? And that's one thing we have to keep in mind. But and I'm sorry if I got off the point there a little bit,
No, it's good
but
stuff.
if we're talking kind of a battle plan, if we're talking how we remediate these things, or rack and stack the risk, one, your security consultant should help. But your security consultant's only going to have a certain level of insight into your risk, especially if it's a first engagement. In
Yeah.
recurring engagements, they learn you a little bit better and they can help more. But if I have a risk that I think is moderate, but it's on your risk assessment as a critical asset, that finding may jump up a notch in your book where maybe it was lower in mine. So the risk assessment is, again, a key part of helping write that roadmap, helping you determine what is the priority for remediation. So that kind of being a big thing. But if we are taking the results of this information and presenting it to an IT steering committee or a security committee, somebody within management, they should also be helping assist with the prioritization of the remediation, and also understand that any of the financial aspects of that remediation, so they kind of see it all play together. But again, the most important thing to us is making sure that management gets that report. I've often told IT people, imagine you own this school or you own this bank, and your IT folks aren't telling you about risk. Your head would pop, right? So make
Yeah.
sure we get that to management, and then they can help sponsor these changes.
I love that. That's a hat tip right there to IT folks, administrators, network administrators, cybersecurity folks working out in the space. You know, please don't take everything as the weight and burden is on your shoulders. Because if you caught that, what Johnny just said there is you need management too to enforce policies and agree with you and agree with your findings, and also help enforce those policies. I think management needs to understand if these policies aren't enforced and they are not carried out and put into place, the risk that the business is in, and what risk does that pose to the business. And I think as IT professionals and cybersecurity professionals, we sort of sometimes fall short at our ability to communicate the risks that it has on the business. And so, we lean on people like you, Johnny, where, hey, help me communicate to the business, to management, the risk that's happening here. You see it, I see it, and we need to communicate it, right?
That communication key is very, very important. We've seen even IT auditors I've worked with way too technical during, let's say, an exit meeting, when the management just needs the highlights. They need to understand, okay, I get there's a finding. I don't care about it being IP version 6 issue. I want to know what the risk is to the organization and how we close that. That two-way communication can be tough, because management also has the responsibility of conveying risk to IT, saying, hey, this is a very important system to us. This is why it's important. Our livelihood is on this system. Help me secure it. Because in IT, we may not understand that 200 people have admin access to, your accounting package. As far as I know, you need it that way. If you're not playing a role in security from the management perspective, that communication will break down, and it's an important two-way process for sure.
Yeah. I love that. Let's just pause there for a second and what do you think? What are the risks of ignoring or delaying action on assessment results?
Whatever that attack surface is that maybe we created the finding on, it remains open, right? That's probably the largest. I mean, there could be regulatory fines and different things like that, but to us, regulatory stuff aside, I mean, what's the cost? What's the expense of that? You brought up PCI earlier. PCI, they fine you if you're not in compliance. Now that's usually for larger organizations, but I've seen small organizations get in trouble as well with that piece. But it also weakens your entire security culture from my perspective. If management's saying, I don't care about that finding, then IT's not going to care. Then the staff member's not going to care that they're clicking that dangerous link. So to me, it's a culture thing.
I love that. I talk about that as much as I possibly can because I truly believe what you just said is that cybersecurity is a culture inside the organization. If management, all the way from founder, CEO, all the way down to, left, right, the team members, the employees, everybody that makes up that company has got to know that culturally speaking, we are in on cybersecurity and we want to be as secure as we possibly can be. But you're right, if you have management saying, I'm not so worried about that or I'm not so worried about this, that starts to trickle down to other people's ears. And then all of a sudden, whether we leave that door unlocked or we leave that port open or we leave, this server or that laptop, or we don't really care about, password usage and vaults and all that stuff. I mean, it just starts to really have a bad, and you might not notice it right away inside the organization, but you talk about 2 months, 3 months, 6 months down the road, the culture starts to erode around cybersecurity.
I always use the analogy, or I like the analogy anyway, of you've walked into your grandmother's house or your aunt's house and you feel like you're walked into a museum and you're acting that way. You're sitting proper on the chair. You're not putting your foot on the furniture. But if you walk into a house that's trashed, you don't care if you dropped a piece of paper or a candy wrapper on the floor or, left the bathroom in a mess because nobody else cares. And I think that's the tone of that stakeholder, that owner is so important. And if they're not in front of it or if they're disengaged or continue to call IT or security an IT problem, I think you're just going to be left with that gap, and it's only going to get bigger.
Yeah, and I'm so happy that you mentioned that, and it's such a thing that I think is overlooked today. That if people don't pay attention to the culture inside the organization around cybersecurity, it's just then all of a sudden initiatives don't really align, and people wonder where did we get off the boat here,
And I want to step back, if we can, to the ignoring or delaying, your actions or remediation plans. Your insurance company is going to care about that.
100%.
You want, I probably should state, when you're dealt with some type of incident or breach and you need to call on that insurance company, I want you to be able to throw as much due diligence on the table as possible. Here's my pen test reports. Here's my IT control testing. Here's my vuln scan. Here's our quarterly steering committee minutes. Here's our patch management reports. Here's everything that we have done to try to secure this environment. It's going to be an easier conversation with them. But if it's a major breach, they're coming in, and right behind them is a forensics team. And if they tear your controls apart, that becomes a very difficult conversation with your insurance provider. So that's something regulators as well, but insurance is one that gets everybody's attention generally.
Well, and to be honest with you, I feel like right now, the tail is wagging the dog. When you bring up cyber insurance, we are seeing organizations lose their coverage because they're a second or third time offender and either getting a breach or some sort of malware outbreak, having to restore systems, doing digital forensics and all of the stuff that comes up after, an incident and a breach. And we're talking about mid-sized companies, large companies, but so the reality is that if you lose your cyber insurance because second or third time offense, this is really no difference if you're a bad driver and you're either going to pay the really bad driver rate, right? Or you're not going to be insurable anymore because you're a bad driver. This logic just comes right over to cybersecurity in how healthy are you keeping the organization, and Johnny, you hit on kind of a nerve because it's like I don't think people really understand. They will come in. Cyber insurance has gotten very smart over the last 5 years, and it's because they were paying out claims and they were not profitable, right? Cyber insurance, the insurance companies are there to be profitable. So if they can't be profitable on your policy, they are not going to offer you a policy.
Correct.
And I think that people just sort of need to realize that's the case and that they need to get their stuff together. Their house has got to be in order. Otherwise, they will not get cyber insurance.
You're right. And not only were they paying the claims and not being profitable, they're paying claims on poor controls. And that's why your insurance policy questionnaire has gone from 1 page to 19 pages. You're signing off saying you have all of these controls in place. So if you were then breached or you have some type of incident where you need to file a claim, they're going to come validate that control has actually been in place. And if it's not, you signed a contract that it was, it very well could, affect your payout. I'm not an insurance provider. I'm not an insurance expert, but we have worked with law firms who deal with clients on the back end of breaches, from incident response to client note or customer notifications. And we see scary numbers that are scary low compared to what you thought you were going to get at a time where you really needed those funds. And a lot of it comes down to poor control environment.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't disagree with you a bit, and we've gotten into long discussions about this. I think that we could probably almost spend a whole fireside chat around cyber insurance and what happens from the time a breach all the way through. But if we come back to the assessment highlights and taking people through this process, where do you sort of see assessment insights and practical security fixes? Where's the crossroads there? Where's the junction, if you get my question?
Yeah, I think I kind of understand. The practical security insights, you maybe need to turn on a control. And I can turn that on today, got that quick fix knocked out, we're good. But if we don't have the proper governance structure and risk structure in place to hold those controls in place, there's a good chance somebody can flip that switch back off.
Yeah.
So that to me is the biggest connection right there, without trying to make a big mess out of it. But if you're going to repair something, if there's been an issue identified, we have to make sure it's in governance and information security policies or risk assessments and everything else to make sure we do not, repeat that issue down the road. And that, again, just that lends itself to maturity and long-term fixes and best practices.
I agree with you. One of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking that came to my mind was you have change management, and so these organizations like, I'll just go implement that. It's like, well, let's talk about that for a moment before you just run and click the button, right? Because what's the cascading effect of clicking that button or putting in that control right now? Just because you can doesn't mean that you should. So a quick chat around that, but as we think about change management and then we think about configuration, there's sort of this new buzz in the space, attack surface management, right? And helping clear up and clean up your attack surface. And oftentimes, I'm thinking about, well, the attack surface is really not only our people, but it's also our configurations of our stuff. And I think that you just, you sort of highlighted what was in my mind was that, you know, somebody can make the change today, and it's the change that you want. It's all agreed upon, but then tomorrow, next week, next month, the change is reversed. Maybe by the same person or maybe somebody else on the team, and they don't understand why that's in place. Being able to detect that change is extremely important, but also to be able to recall the risk and the reason why you put that change in place in the first place. A month from now, say, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts there.
I do. So one of the things you kind of touched on there, all the frameworks now are hitting on baseline configuration. Do you have baseline configurations in place? Are you going through proper change processes if you're going to alter that baseline configuration? Are you updating your baseline configurations after an IT control test? So are we deploying machines with a vulnerability to our switches, whatever that may be? So are we addressing that and updating it? But when it comes time for the change management aspect, you're absolutely right. I used to teach Cisco Networking Academy back in the day, and out of everything I taught, the most important thing I wanted people to leave there with is document everything. If you are making a change, or if you've done a ton of homework to find a fix, let's document that in our change management database. Make it searchable so the next person who's facing that tough fix has a method to go find it. But the same is true for risk. If we're entering into changes without addressing risk, obviously that's a huge mistake, and under and back out procedures and all the standard change management things. But the biggest issue I see in change management is just the lack of communication. Are we communicating to the stakeholders? Are we communicating it to people within IT of the change we're about to make on a system? If that communication is in place, I think you avoid a lot of issues. But the proper change management, baseline configurations, those things help avoid that. And maybe people are watching this and they don't have that big of a structure. Maybe they're an office of 15 people. Your change management's a lot simpler. But if you're going to do one thing in change management, is communicate to those users of the system, hey, we have to do this at noon on Saturday. Nobody's working this weekend, right? That's perfect change management start right there. So some of these topics may be for larger organizations and more sophisticated, but I think everything can be altered in a way to apply with a smaller organization. This building being a perfect example, 2 days ago, we had an electrician back here. He notified nobody that he was taking power down. So we're in the middle of production, and 3 people come walking down the hall. Hey, I was going to go check the router. What happened? So I walk back there, and there's an electrician in the closet, shut down the whole building. Didn't tell anybody.
Isn't that, communication, I think we've said it a couple of times now, is very key. You need to communicate with your other parties that may be affected, may not be, but hey, at least you communicated it, right, ahead of time. But, like in BitLyft, we use a tool, a system to help us baseline configuration. That's so important. And I'm very happy that the frameworks today all include that. Because you need to know what the configuration of your equipment, your M365, your conditional access policies, your Google G Suite, your AWS. You need to know what the configuration of those are today, tomorrow, next week. You also need to know when that change or that configuration changes. You need to know the minute it changes and who changed it, right?
Right.
Because if you're dealing with an IT team of 1 or 2 or 3 people, and other people have some admin controls, and they go change something on you, and they don't realize what they just changed has a adverse effect, but it has an adverse effect. Well, all of a sudden, you now need to go pay attention to that. You need to go fix that problem before it's a door left open for a really long time. And That sounds simple to probably most people. But
Okay.
all I'm telling you is we have seen it with our own eyes inside of our SOC. There's a lot of still working remote from home, even though there's Microsoft Teams and Slack and things like that. The challenge is people don't communicate simple changes to their whole team, and then what happens is something gets left open, and an adverse action takes place, and it causes a bad day, a bad night, a bad weekend,
If not worse, yeah.
if not worse. Yeah, I'm being relatively conservative there, but but yeah, I mean, we're big believers that configuration is a base foundation. I'm sure that you'd probably agree with this because it's the truth. But if you read a lot of breach reports, the breach reports, more breaches happened from open access or lack of controls than
Misconfiguration, yeah.
misconfiguration. Yep. Than 0 days. I mean, it's something like 80 to 90% it comes from misconfiguration and those likes versus the 0 days.
Well, I think it's an interesting stat. It started trending a few years ago when you saw insider attacks or insider, I guess, sourced or initiated breaches, let's say. That percentage was always really, really low and pretty flat. And then suddenly it started ticking up a little bit. So I dug in. I'm like, oh man, we're going to get some juicy stories out of this one for speeches and everything else. Well, it wasn't. It was mistakes. It was errors. It was an the attack happened or the failure happened or the unintended breach happened internally because of a misconfiguration, not because somebody, you had an insider sitting there stealing data or something. So
Yeah.
that has, and that's still ticking up. It's the misconfiguration is still rising. Cloud misconfigurations ticking up.
I completely agree there. We watch those stats as well. I think digging into those reports is a fun thing to do because it's always fact finding. How did this take place? What was the root cause analysis? And when you read those root cause analysis, you find out, oh gosh, I probably could have that problem too.
Yeah,
You
there's a
know,
few of those. I'm like, I need to go check that setting when I get back to the office. That kind of
yeah,
thing, for sure.
yeah.
But
So so it's been great chatting with you here, and I know that we are sort of coming up to time, and I want to be respectful of the rest of your day, and I certainly appreciate you taking the time out to sit with me on this conversation. But as we're sort of wrapping up, what are some of the biggest lessons that you could maybe share with the listeners from organizations moving from assessment to action? You've done either your readiness assessment or you've done a full assessment. Now, how do you sort of, leave that organization prepped and primed to move into action?
I think remediate as soon as possible. It doesn't mean you can go click every button just immediately because you can click it. A lot of communication has to take place. Um, I think part of that also is for management even to understand that it's going to take time. If we give you a chunk of findings, let's say, even if we gave you 8, one of those 8 may be difficult, or 2 of those 8. So I'd say, one, if you don't close it immediately, document why you haven't closed it immediately so you can continue to convey that to management. And while they're assessing the risk of that, determining if they can find the funds to help close that risk, I think you as IT and security officer management should be doing your homework on any compensating controls you can help to address that open risk while you're looking for the ultimate remediation. But some of this also goes back to management. Management has to support these events. They need to support the not only the assessment itself, but demanding some type of periodic status updates on those open findings. Are we gaining ground here? Are we getting better? That's probably some of the big ones there. If management or an audit committee or somebody like that has their finger on the pulse saying, hey, Johnny, where are we? Last month when we met, you thought you were closing that, but it's still open. That puts pressure. That's pressure from the top down, and the tone from the top down that's going to just help enforce and make that transition easier.
Yeah, and I think some practical advice there. If you document it and you document why this is still open, and you document maybe even the next steps that have been discussed and talked about, anxiety won't flutter its way in, to the situation. Whoever's asking about that, well, you could say, "Hey, I understand you're trying to apply some pressure to me, but here's where we're at," and you can refer right back to your document. And maybe something's changed that you weren't aware of. Maybe now all of a sudden you've got a sponsor, or now all of a sudden you've got the money, or you've got the budget, or you've got what you need to move that item along. And so maybe they're asking because they want to know, is this still an open item? But I can't stress that enough. That's great practical advice. If you're documenting those things, stress, anxiety, pressure, sort of gets removed from the situation because you've documented it. I had a conversation with so-and-so, and we came up with this, and this is our plan of attack.
It also takes away that maybe that misconception that, well, IT's not even paying attention to this. They've gotten lazy on it. But if you're documenting what you're going through, and a lot of times your documentation is probably going to stop with, management says we can't pay for that right now. Management says that's not in the budget, but at some point, I want management to own that risk. It's not sitting on my side of the table, in the conference room with IT. I've conveyed the risk. I've conveyed what we have to do to fix it. I'm waiting on management to tell me to pull the trigger. I'm waiting on management to give me the $50,000 I need, or the transition to AWS, whatever we have to do. But documentation is important, even on the regulator side. If you're a bank, and most banks know this, but if you have it documented and you have a really solid understanding of why you are where you are, your bank regulators definitely go easier on you. If they know you have eyes on the risk and you're addressing it, that just makes it, removes stress and potential bigger findings, MOUs and other things that banks get.
Yeah. Yeah, that is great advice. I can't stress it enough. And I feel like people just need to take it. Some people feel like documentation is painful. I feel like no documentation and then a situation is even more painful. So I'd rather go through a little bit of pain and document things than potentially have a situation and then there's no documentation.
Absolutely.
So Johnny, just what are some final thoughts here on sharing with our listeners future assessments as a tool for staying ahead in the cybersecurity threats? Do you have any final thoughts maybe that we didn't touch on yet, but just as people are looking down the road at doing assessments here and maybe tools or ways to go about this?
You said tools twice there, and I wish I could remember the analogy my dad had for tools. It was something silly along the lines of, it's a toolbox. It's a box of tools. It's not just one tool.
Yeah.
You cannot rely on the results of an IT control test that aligns with NIST cybersecurity framework to put you in a positive security place. It's trending you in the right direction, but it's not going to close all the doors. You have to use multiple tools. You need to do your penetration testing. You need to do some type of vulnerability scanning. Some do that weekly. That may be too frequent. Some do it monthly, but it needs to be done so you see the new vulnerabilities as they pop up. That's a big piece. Adding more tools to it, doing some social engineering work, be it phishing, in-person social engineering, whatever you feel matches your risk best. Personally, to me, if you're not addressing phishing and doing some type of simulated phishing attacks on your staff to kind of test their awareness level, you're failing. You certainly should be doing that. The vulnerability scans, again, are really important. But I think, lastly, make sure whoever's at the top of this information security pyramid, they're qualified to do it, that they're qualified to give the proper advice to management and the proper advice to IT. And I know in small environments, and I don't make a big deal out of it. There's the CIO may be wearing both hats, or the IT director may be wearing both hats. As long as someone has the hat on for security, I'm happy,
Yeah.
because most of us don't hire security people to go on IT. We hire IT operations people. And most IT operations people are not security people. That's not what they went to school for. That's not their passion. So
Right.
you just have to make sure whoever is at the running security is qualified and trained to do it.
And on that note, I feel like one of the things that come from our angle that we've done this a lot with customers is roundtable exercises. So you mentioned a lot of great things there. I also want to emphasize one tool is not a one size fits all, right?
Right.
Sometimes people use vulnerability scanners and that's their asset inventory, and they try to figure out a way to also make that their configuration management tool, and oftentimes it's not. I see some tools out in the space that have a multi-layered approach where they can be subject matter experts at a couple of things, but most of the time tools are not subject matter experts at 20 things.
Right.
They are very much subject matter experts at one or two, maybe three things. And I think recognizing that and trying to make sure that you don't have the universal Swiss Army knife, trying to do all things. But I just want to emphasize, if you have not done a roundtable exercise inside your organization, again, doesn't matter what size the organization is. We've done them with people that have 10 to 20 employees, and we've done cybersecurity roundtable exercises with organizations that have 500 to thousands of employees. But just performing the exercise is eye-opening. And I don't know if you feel this way too, Johnny, but oftentimes it's eye-opening for the people that are involved, and they realize now, like, oh, we need to make some changes. I didn't realize how that affected others. If we're no longer communicating over email, what are we doing? If we're not communicating over Slack or Teams because we think that somebody's listening or watching, I think all these things are extremely important that get opened up, and that the sort of, trying to phrase it the right way, but just awareness really starts to take place when a tabletop exercise is performed.
I agree, be it incident response or disaster recovery, business continuity, the team members at that table, that's some of their training, right? And you learn in this response process, okay, do our procedures that we have outlined in the policy, will they actually work this way? You identify gaps. So when you really need it, one, the team has gone through this roundtable exercise a few times, or this tabletop exercise a few times, and they understand what their role is, and they respond. And that's kind of been another one of the things we've always said. We want you responding to an incident, not reacting to it. So if you're not going through these exercises, you're reacting. Well, what do we do next? Well, a good incident response plan will walk you through that. But if you haven't tested and trained with it, you may run around a little bit disconnected for a while.
Yeah, completely agree. Well, Johnny, we touched on some great topics today, and I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to meet with me. And then I'd love to have you back.
Anytime.
There was so many conversations that we really didn't even dive into that I wish we would have, but we're sort of running out of time for today. But I greatly appreciate you and all the things that you're doing in the cybersecurity space, and I wish you the best of luck, and look forward to talking with you again sometime here in the near future.
Thanks, Jason. I appreciate it. Anytime. And maybe next time we'll grab our pen tester. He always has great stories too. So anytime we'd like to do that. Yeah.
That would be awesome. So if you're looking for a risk assessment, a readiness assessment, or somebody to point you in the right direction, highly would recommend you reach out to Johnny Sanders at SOMA Cyber. Johnny, do you want to give your URL, your website?
It's somacyber.com, and I'm johnny.sanders at somacyber.com. It's pretty straightforward. Our quick Google search will get you to us, but I appreciate that plug there. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, absolutely. We probably should have put that at the beginning, but
No worries.
everybody will have to listen until the end to get that info. But yeah, so thanks so much, and hope you have a great rest of your week, Johnny.
Thank you very much. We enjoyed this.
Awesome.